If you are like me, and you belong to that great ancient strain of monotheism vulgarly known as Christianity, and if, like me, you unashamedly fraternize with the most secular and skeptical of your earthly brethren, you may have had an interaction like this. In some kind of casual conversation, the topic turns to the Bible, or Christianity, or religion in general, and someone you're speaking to comes with a question about Old Testament law with a curious heart and all the best intentions. What about shellfish? What about uncircumcised people today? What about the mixed fabrics you're wearing? What about slavery? And what about that goat? And you may have nervously stumbled through an explanation about Jewish religious customs, now undone by Jesus Christ, who gave us one commandment, to love each other. And if you were feeling particularly brave, and particularly enthusiastic about the uniting church perhaps, you may have gone on to talk about the law of Jesus Christ being more radical than the most bizarre and antiquated religious laws of old. You might have waxed mystical about the commandment to love being a commandment to self-martyrdom in league with the oppressed, standing up to the oppressors. And you may have left that conversation feeling vaguely unsatisfied. There are problems that come with that kind of explanation. Obviously, the Messiah said, "I've come not to destroy the law, but to fulfill it." There's a risk of relying on easy platitudes about love in a way that we refuse to actually follow. And there's a risk of mocking these ancient laws and thinking ourselves above them when so many of these laws actually existed for a reason. What is law? Why is law? Who is law for? Try saying that 10 times fast. And what does ancient law do for us today? I want to tell a story from my own life, but before I do, I want to let you know it's centered around physical violence and it has some mentions of drug abuse and all of the triggers that come with that. So if that's a problem for you, if you want to step out for 15 minutes or so, the hall up there is probably warmer than outside, so if you need to step out, feel free. So before I started working for the Uniting Church, I worked at a music school on Norton Street, just up there. And on Saturdays, I would usually have a gap in my teaching at around 1, and I would walk up the road to grab a coffee. On one such Saturday, I saw a very, very distressed-looking person on the other side of the street, looking around frantically, being ignored by passers-by. I crossed the street to see what was going on, and as I grew closer, I got a better idea of who this person was. An Indigenous woman, probably in her 40s or 50s, aged far beyond her years by stress and hardship, dull gray hair and a weathered face. And I'm not sure why it took me so long, but it was only once I was standing right in front of her that I saw what the problem was. Embedded in her hands, the front side of both of her arms and parts of her chest were large shards of broken glass. She was soaked in blood, and so was the concrete. She looked up at me and said in a very small voice, "Can you help me?" I asked her to sit down while I called an ambulance, and I made a terrible mistake. In a misguided attempt to console this woman, I told her everything was going to be okay, and I put my hand on her shoulder. And the second my skin touched her, some switch flipped inside. "You motherfucker," were the words she screamed at me again and again. And she proceeded to wage war on my face with her fists. I later found out she was on ice, and what I learned about ice was that it grants incredible strength to the smallest of people. I didn't want to run away and leave her, and I certainly didn't want to fight back against this person who was suffering more than I have ever seen a person suffer. So I stood there, doing my best to move out of the way of her fists, but not being a very skilled boxer, taking a majority of her blows to my chin, nose, and jaw. This went on for about 5 minutes, and I don't know if it was the repeated head injury or something else, but I had a lot of time to think while this was going on. The first thing I thought about was my own mistake. I had broken this stranger's trust because I hadn't considered that this very traumatized, very upset, very distressed person probably didn't want to be touched. The second thing I thought about was my own disposition, which struck me as pretty unusual. The few times I'd been punched in the face before this, I'd been completely overcome with a blind rage, an urge to retaliate, and if you've played a sport or you're an athlete of any kind, or you watch the news, you'll know that it takes a lot less than physical violence to stir up those feelings inside you, right? But I felt none of that. I looked at this poor, bleeding, suffering woman and saw only pain, only trauma, only an urge to escape from this person who had just touched her. I saw a struggling human in the throes of addiction and blood loss, and in some very strange way that I still have a hard time expressing, I saw the grace of God. I saw what Moses' people saw, God who lives in a cloudy darkness. I don't think this speaks to my character at all. I'm quite bad at choosing to see God in people who harmed me. I really feel like God was physically present in some strange way on that Saturday. And I really believe that if anyone else was in the way of that woman's fist getting painted red with her blood, they would have felt exactly as I felt. But there was one other thing that I had time to think about as I stood, getting punched in the face. People around me were doing one of two things. Some were fleeing the vicinity, but most were laughing. The first response is perfectly understandable, and to their credit, at least one person called the police. It took at least 8 men to restrain this tiny woman. Her nervous system flooded with drugs and determination to get away. She got in several hits to the faces of these officers, and while she was being subdued and carried to the ambulance, she shouted some of the most horrifying obscenities that I've ever heard, each one containing some truth, some glimpse of a trauma that had happened to her. And at each increasingly disturbing outburst, bystanders laughed and looked at each other knowingly, like they were all in on the same joke. It felt very strange to see Christ in this woman who looked like she wanted to kill me, and even stranger to see her crucifiers in the people who were on my side. There is more to this story. Epworth residents may remember me walking into the crowded lounge room with a bloody face, but I'm going to end the story there for the sake of what I want to say tonight. I thought about that day a lot in the lead up to this sermon. I've always found it so confusing in the context of what we're told under Christian law. It's a very modern situation. I experienced it very recently. There are many parties involved with very different contexts. And when I think about the Bible, when I think about the Ten Commandments, which are moral laws so ingrained in society that they're secular values, right? You don't have to have grown up Christian to take them as ways to live. And I find myself really confused about what this reading means for people living today. In the crimes that this woman confessed to, screaming while being held down by 8 men, I could find her guilty of breaking at least 7 of these commandments, while our jeering onlookers, as far as I understand, broke none. Does that make her less deserving of the kingdom of heaven? In trying, as many of us do, to apply that great evangelical adage, WWJD, woo, I tried to show care and love for this woman, but I touched her and I hurt her. And it seems to me like if I'd done a de-escalation course or something like that, that would have helped me help her more than anything I've ever read in the Bible. But I'm sort of a stubborn person, and I refuse to be swayed from the belief that the commandments of Moses and the commandments of Jesus are there for a reason. And I do believe that they're relevant today. And the more I think about it, the more I turn it over in my head, earthly law, justice, all these things, the more I'm convinced that the commandment we cannot stop breaking, all of us, is idol worship. Idol worship is what so many of us automatically think when we hear the words violent drug addict, and for many, it's even worse to hear the phrase violent indigenous drug addict. Idol worship is the automatic impulse to shut off our ability to love a certain type of person, to laugh at the deeply suffering. Idol worship is the unconscious absorption of propaganda that tells us who is deserving of love and who is deserving of nothing but punishment. It is the worship of the state that crucified the Son of God, and it is the worship of the state that plans to annihilate Gaza. Idol worship is thinking that my touch on a grievously injured person is enough to fix them. Idol worship is the belief in a Christianity where all is light, where darkness and brokenness go unacknowledged, and we refuse to see God in that thick darkness. The thick darkness where God is. I don't think there's a phrase in the Bible that better captures my experience of belief. God is enmeshed and present with the deepest sufferings in history, and it is idol worship when we refuse to look there. The mighty God who sounded trumpets in the air and lit up the sky for Moses and his people with lightning is the very same God who suffered beside the crucified Christ, and that same Christ was there with the suffering woman I met that day. This woman, whose hardships I can barely imagine, were reduced in the eyes of dozens of onlookers to the outbursts of a crazy junkie, and for many of them, they'll never be remembered any other way. We know not to murder, and we know not to steal. We don't need to hear that, but it's the worship of our prejudices and of the gods we put before the true God that leads to the murder of millions and the theft of land. When we put our idols before our God, we forget that this God who led Moses and his Jews out of Egypt will also lead our prisoners and our most violent criminals to salvation. God loves ice addicts, and God loves petty thieves. God loves writers, chefs, laborers, doctors, ministers, and priests all the same. God is there when you lose a parent, and God is there when you stub your toe. God rejoices when a slave is freed, and God rejoices when a child picks a flower. God was there in the heart of the owner of Bar Italia who gave me a free cannoli after getting hit in the face. And I know that wherever that woman is today, God is with her too. It is idol worship to forget that. Thank you.